Good morning. Welcome to day 19 of this 31-day study through the book of Proverbs. One chapter each day, 31 days, 31 chapters. Today, Proverbs 19. I encourage you to read them before watching the video, make some observations, draw some lines, circle words, the things that kind of jump off the paper that God might be using to speak to you directly. I think, we talked about this already, but one of the advantages of doing a chapter a day is that we can easily recall, at least the last couple of days. And if you're journaling at all, that even helps with retention. But Proverbs 19, we see some familiar topics and themes that have been running through this entire book. We talked about this just a few days ago about my choice and God's control. And we see that in chapter 19 in verse 3. It says, people ruin their lives by their own foolishness and then are angry at the Lord. Right? So we make our own choices at times of things we want to do. If we're a follower of Jesus, then we have the Holy Spirit who's leading our lives, from the inside with those spiritual nudges. And oftentimes we do things we know we shouldn't do, or we don't do things that we know we should do. And we find ourselves in a place that we shouldn't have been. It's, pretty strong language here that people ruin their lives by their own foolishness. But that's what will happen if we continue to lead our lives away from God. The second line of that proverb is, though, and then are angry at the Lord. I've experienced this personally. I've counseled many people. I had lots of conversations with people who have found themselves in a mess that they've made, following their own desires apart from God, and then they're mad at God for either letting it happen, for not stopping something, or for not fixing it. And this goes back to the principle of reaping and sowing that we just talked about, right? We reap what we sow. So we do have free choice. God is in control, but we can't be angry at him for the choices we've made and the situations that we find ourselves in. Right? We can turn back to him. We can apologize. We can confess to him our wrongdoing, and we can be made right with him, and we can follow him out of the mess we're in. Many of us, our stories, mine as well, that he makes a masterpiece out of our messes. He's working, our lives if we allow him to, and he can really make a bold message about his love and forgiveness through the messes that we make when we turn them over to him. The second verse that talks about kind of my choice and God's control is verse 21, which says, you can make many plans, but the Lord's purpose will prevail. We saw this too. This idea that we can make plans, God determines the steps, it said in a previous chapter here, the Lord's purpose will prevail. We know the Lord's purpose will prevail. Ultimately, he has a plan to restore his children to him, to restore order and chaos. Jesus will return again the second time to put things back in order. His purpose will prevail. But we are making choices every day between now and the second coming of Christ, that our free will is determining, and we can choose our way or God's way. So just again, the encouragement to use our free choice that we've been given to choose what is right and to choose to follow Christ in all ways. The second one was about wisdom. This, and obviously that's through every chapter, but this one is about the personal gain of wisdom, like what I get from wisdom, which I thought was a little bit different than what we've seen. In verse 8, he says, to acquire wisdom is to love yourself. People who cherish understanding will prosper. And then in verse 20, he says, get all the advice and instruction you can, so you will be wise the rest of your life. This idea that we pursue wisdom, it's there. We can have it, we can obtain it, but we do this as an investment in ourselves, right? This is to love yourself. This is, oftentimes we want to spoil ourselves with, making some purchase that we know we probably shouldn't make, or eating something we probably shouldn't eat because, we've had a rough day, or, maybe got a promotion or whatever, and we justify rewarding ourselves. The Proverbs said, listen, if you love yourself, you want to reward yourself, acquire wisdom, right? Because this is something that won't go away. You'll cherish understanding, and it will help you prosper, right? Help you make the right choices to follow God, and then to get all the advice and instruction you can, and you'll be wise the rest of your life, right? These things can't be taken away from us. Wisdom, instruction, understanding, discernment, those types of things. So we should always be in learning mode, seeking wisdom through instruction and correction, even though the correction part's not always easy. But if we love ourselves and we know that God has more for us, and we want to discern that, then we should just be a sponge, continually looking for ways to grow in our wisdom. The last one I want to talk about is in verse 17, this idea of the poor. We've seen the poor, and there's more about the poor in 19, but in verse 17 it says, if you help the poor, you are lending to the Lord, and he will repay you. Now, we've seen in 1431 and verse 17, chapter 17, verse 5, this idea of if you mock the poor, you're insulting their maker, that our actions against another person have a direct impact on God. And here we see kind of a positive impact. If you help the poor, you're lending to the Lord, and he will repay you. So the good that we would do for somebody in need, sure, it benefits them in the moment, in the time, but it's lending it to the Lord. Like, right, he says lending it, not giving it, lending it to the Lord, and he will repay you. Unlike us, sometimes we take, we borrow, we don't return but God is not like that. He says you are lending to the Lord, and he will repay you. This made me think about the parable of the three servants. When the landowner went away, he left them with talents, and what did they do with them? And one buried them, and two of them invested them, and when he came back, he was very angry with the one that did nothing but bury his talents. The other two invested and got more. And in verse 29 of chapter 25 of Matthew, he says, to those who use well what they are given, even more will be given, and they will have an abundance. But for those who do nothing, even what little they have will be taken away. Right? God has entrusted us with things, time that we have, the talents that we have, the gifts that he's given each of us, and then the physical resources, money, stuff, the things we have around. How can we use all of that to help other people? If we understand that we're stewards, we're managers, not owners, that all of it is God. So really what we're doing is we're taking what God has given us, using it for his work, which is lending it to him, and he's repaying it back to us. This idea of being generous. The Matthew 25:29 comes, 28 talks about, not to judge or condemn, or you'll be judged or condemned, and to forgive or you won't be forgiven. And then it goes into, Luke 6:38, that if you give and you will receive. So this idea that we give to God, right, with the right heart, not because he's an investment banker, but because we see that he's entrusted us with things that he wants us to use for his work to make an impact in the world around us. So he says, give and you will receive. Your gift will return to you in full, right? This is the idea of God repaying. But here's the thing. He doesn't repay, minute for minute or dollar for dollar or whatever it is that we've given to another person. It says, your gift will return to you in full, pressed down, right? Think about pressing like flour down into a measuring cup, shaken together, right? Trying to get more into that cup to make room for more, running over and poured into your lap. The amount you give will determine the amount you get back, but God always gives more. We can never outgive God. And the right heart would be to see people in need and not judge or condemn or mock them, but to help and to see that what God's given us is really for his kingdom, to do his work. So are we managing well all that God has entrusted us with? Right? He's going to ask us, just like the parable of the three servants. He's going to come back and say, what have you done? Right? And if we say, I held on to all of it, right, he's not going to be pleased. He wants us to use it for his work, and he will return more back. So are we taking the resources God has given us to do good, to help others, to see his work is being done by the hands and feet of his children on this earth right now, with the things, the time, the stuff, the abilities, the gifts that he's given them. So I hope that challenges you a little bit. I look forward to Proverbs 20 tomorrow. Thanks for joining me. I'll see you then.